Up, 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 up. Up, 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 up. Up, up, up. Up, up, up. Happy 50th anniversary of independence, Sunset City.
I'm really not a big believer in independence celebrations because, to me, these celebrations represent a facade of freedom from a foreign colonial government that once ruled over a non-represented people. Sometimes we get caught up in the illusions of freedom without taking into consideration that freedom does not come, necessarily, through the recognition by the colonial state. And, as Albert Einstein once said, freedom is not something that is achieved. It's something that one must continue to fight for. And when you look at the spirit of Grenadians at this so-called 50-year anniversary of independence, you see a people who have always had an independent spirit and have always been an independent people from day one. When the Spanish colonizers first tried to conquer Grenada in the late 1400s, the Kalinago natives ran them from the island. Years later, the French had a bit more success in their conquest of the island, but the indigenous Kalinago did not go down without a fight in Grenada. As a matter of fact, when the Kalinago natives were left with the option of either enslavement or death, they chose the latter and leapt to their death at Leapers Hill, at modern-day Satirs, located in the parish of St. Patrick. We're walking to Leapers Hill, very important landmark for freedom fighters of Grenada.
Excuse me. Is that where they jumped over? Yeah.
The Caribs, look at, you know when I came here, they didn't have all this?
All of that.
And they didn't have the brochure, somebody handing you none. I noticed Grenada has advanced. Yeah, all the way you go.
How do they do that?
Like, see, she's still coming in. She will do what it's want to do.
They didn't have this before. I don't understand. How do they push it back?
Yeah, those are the islands.
How do they push the water?
After the French took control over Grenada, with the indigenous populations refusing to surrender and resorting to collective suicide, France made the decision to start importing African captives from the continent and neighboring islands to serve as their slave labor force. The Africans in Grenada, too, did not take their forced captivity lightly. When the British made claims to Grenada after the 7 Years' War in 1763, they began to import large amounts of Africans straight from the African continent. It is the descendants of these Africans during the transatlantic slave trade that are the ancestors of the majority of Grenadians today. And where did the majority of these Grenadians come from? Over half of the imports came from what is present-day Ghana and Nigeria. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 36% of Africans that arrived in Grenada were from the Bight of Biafra region of present-day Nigeria and West Africa, while another 19% arrived from the Gold Coast. The majority of Africans that passed through the ports of the Bight of Biafra came from the hinterland, which was peopled by the Igbo. The Igbo, like the Kalinago, were characterized by colonial authorities as being predisposed to suicide instead of remaining enslaved. The Igbo philosophical understanding of the universe placed much more importance in merit based on egalitarian living rather than fixed social hierarchies and social stratification. A popular Igbo expression was Igbo enwe ese, which translates to the Igbo has no king. They were a people who did not believe in being ruled, nor did they believe in ruling others. Anthropologists call their society an acephalous society, or a society without a head or a ruler. They lived in organized villages, which made decisions through general consensus, because they placed much more importance in living in freedom and harmony than they did in promoting a security state full of strife. A disharmonious society leads to societal ills. Societal ills leads to depression, and depression leads to suicide, which they believed can corrupt the energy of an entire people in that society. This paradox of suicide being the biggest disgrace among the Igbo, while they were the most notorious for committing this act in the diaspora during slavery, was a testament to the egregiousness of British slavery, as well as their belief in the transmigration of the soul and their belief in reincarnation. On British plantations, the good and harmonious world that the Igbo knew was flipped on its head, therefore making suicide a necessity to escape the brutality of plantation life. Many of the rebel Grenadians were sent off the island and transported to Dominica, where they would engage in their own revolutionary movement throughout the rest of the 18th into the early 19th century. This democratic egalitarianism is a characteristic that would remain within the Grenadian people throughout history. On the other hand, there was the Akan people, who were referred to as the Coromantee by slave traders. They were dominated by the Ashanti and Fanti nations. The people from this region comprised of 18% of those transported into Grenada. The Coromantee were usually characterized as being fierce warriors in the diaspora. You can actually find Akan day names in surnames of Grenada today, such as Kujo, Kwame, Kwamina, and Kwashi. As the Igbo were notorious for being runaway slaves, creating independent Maroon communities, committing suicide, and fighting to the death over losing freedom, the Akan came from a warrior society where their presence was felt throughout the diaspora in their connection to a number of major slave rebellions in Maroon communities over the years. With the rise of the transatlantic slave trade to Grenada after the island's acquisition by the British in 1763, the resistance movements in the island commenced. By 1765, there was a Maroon community developing in the mountains of Grenada. The community was becoming such a nuisance to the planters that Grenada Governor Robert Melville wrote to London in September of 1765 that there were, quote, runaway slaves, of whom there has always been 200 or 300 sheltered in the woody mountains of this island, and subsisting themselves chiefly by depredations on the cattle and ground provisions of the nearest estate, close quote. This short-lived Maroon community would remain strong until 1771. 1 year before the Maroon community around Mount Kwakwa was crushed, Grenada's shipment of African captives received a 13-year-old enslaved Fanti boy from the Gold Coast named Kwamina Ottobah Cuguano. He spent almost 2 years slaving away on Grenada's sugar plantations until he was sold to a merchant who took him to England in 1772. To Cuguano's good fortune, the Somerset case of 1772 liberated all the enslaved people in England that same year. Cuguano would go on to learn how to read and write in English and write an autobiography entitled Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of the Slavery and Commerce of the Human Species. He became a devout abolitionist and one of the leading voices for the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in London. He linked up with fellow emancipated African Ottobah Cuguano to form the abolitionist organization called the Sons of Africa. Through his voice, he remained instrumental in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. Nevertheless, only 3 years before Cuguano was transported into Grenada, an enslaved boy, who would later be known as Henri Christophe, was born in the island. Kristoff was born to an enslaved woman and a free black man and retained the revolutionary African spirit. He was sent over to the French colony of Saint-Domingue as a slave, where he would later serve in the French army in his fight against the British during America's War for Independence, where he would eventually earn his freedom. He would go on to being one of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution, a black revolution that expelled all the white colonials from the island along with their institution of slavery. The Grenadian-born Henri Christophe would become the second president of a free Haiti, a country that would remain the citadel and example of freedom for Africans throughout the diaspora. While Henri Christophe was leading troops into battle during the Haitian Revolution throughout the 1790s, back home, in 1795-1796, Grenadians would attempt a coup of the British colonial government as well. Julien Fedon, a mulatto planter, liberated his enslaved and led a war of revolution against the British colonials. 7,000 enslaved Africans would rise up, destroying sugar plantations taking over the entire island aside from St. George's. The black revolutionaries took over Grenada until the summer of 1796, until the British colonials brought in black reinforcements to quell the rebellion. The Grenadian revolutionaries wreaked havoc in the island, leading to massive losses and profits in Grenada. A combination of the Haitian Revolution, the Fedon Rebellion, as well as other black rebellions in the Caribbean forced the British to make the prudent decision to abolish slavery to avoid threat of losing island, as had transpired in Haiti, and almost succeeded in Grenada. Nevertheless, as the British abolished the transatlantic slave trade, in part due to the perceived rebellious nature of enslaved Africans in Grenada, as well as other islands, an illegal slave trade persisted to mostly the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. Many of the enslaved during this illegal period of the slave trade were arriving from the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Benin, and West Central Africa. They were mostly Igbo, Yoruba, and Bakongo. Nevertheless, as these ships were considered illegal under British de facto international law, the Crown policed the high seas, condemning and confiscating those with African cargo and sending them to their own colonies. A few of these condemned ships in particular, on their way to Cuba, arrived in Grenada from the Bight of Benin, where the Oyo Empire had collapsed earlier in the 19th century and a slave trade developed in the region. The British euphemistically called these captive Africans, once released into their own English colonies after confiscation, quote, liberated Africans, close quote. However, there was a whole slew of liberated Yoruba Africans making their way into Grenada as indentured servants in the early to mid-19th century. There were two liberated Africans in particular, who would eventually be known as Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon, who got married and had children. Jupiter cherished freedom and understood the importance of land ownership to ensure this freedom. After his time served in indentured servitude, he eventually acquired his own land and became a carpenter. Moreover, Jupiter and Mary Jane had a daughter named Edith, and when she was 11 years old, was raped by an elder Scottish man. The product of this rape was Louise Langdon, who would grow up to become the mother of the late, great Malcolm X.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be by any means necessary.
In Grenada, however, Louise Langdon was raised by her Yoruba grandparents, who instilled in her African values the importance of self-sufficiency, as well as emphasizing the graveness of constantly struggling for one's freedom. Louise would eventually leave Grenada for Canada and then the United States, where she met her husband and got heavily involved in Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, also known as the UNIA. Louise became an editor for the UNIA newspaper and instilled the principles of freedom, self-sufficiency, and black nationalism that she learned in Grenada to her children, including a young Malcolm X. After Louise's husband Earl was killed by the KKK, the Grenadian-born activist began to struggle severely with mental health and her ability to provide for her children. Malcolm turned to a life of crime and succumbed to the prison system. But through the values that his mother and father instilled in him at a very young age, was able to overcome, becoming the national spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. This charismatic leader grew the membership of the Nation of Islam between 1952 and 1963. He preached black pride, self-reliance, self-defense, and independence for black people. In 1963, after he left the Nation of Islam, his rhetoric became increasingly black nationalist. Whereas, as a member of the Nation of Islam, much of his rhetoric was spoken on behalf of the nation's leader, Elijah Muhammad, and was very spiritual in essence. After Malcolm's departure, he became devoted to the secular struggle for human rights for all people, but especially for those of African descent living in the United States.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not American. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America.
In 1964, Malcolm visited the Middle East and Africa, linking up with various heads of state in the newly independent countries, seeking support to bring charges against the United States for committing crimes against humanity when concerned with the African American community. These efforts by Malcolm X made him a target by the FBI and CIA during the Cold War, to the point that there was a conspiracy to assassinate the charismatic Grenadian American leader. With the meddling by the U.S. government informants and agents in the Nation of Islam and Malcolm's newly formed Organization of Afro-American Unity, the black organizations had become either completely corrupted or had treacherous elements among members. As a result, Malcolm X was assassinated by NOI members on February 21, 1965. Nevertheless, Malcolm X's charisma and fiery speeches would inspire black revolutionary movements all throughout the diaspora, including the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in the United States, but also revolutionary movements at home in Grenada with Maurice Bishop's New Jewel movement. In the 1970s, after Grenada was granted independence from Britain, the Crown installed a puppet dictatorship under Sir Eric Gary. However, Maurice Bishop, influenced by Malcolm X, among others, played a major role in plotting the overthrow of the neo-colonial Grenadian government. Grenada, during the 1970s, for the Western powers, was to be a banana republic, ruled by an iron fist and exploited by Western imperial interests. The Monroe Doctrine of 1823 and its corollary in 1904 had dictated to a large extent the terms and conditions of independence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States and their closest Western allies maintained control over the outcome of elections, the economies, land distribution, and policies of the developing countries. There were very few countries that were able to rip off the yoke of US-UK imperialism, and Grenada, for a moment, was one of them. On March 13, 1979, Maurice Bishop, Bernard Cord, and other members of the New Jewel movement seized access of the airwaves, as Malcolm X once pointed out in one of his speeches, and led a bloodless coup d'etat of the imperial government.
When you have a revolution in the country, the first thing you take over is the radio. And then you start telling the people, that everybody, the war is over. And so all of them surrender. No, they believe that thing right there. And once they take that over, they start telling you where you are and where they are, and you fall right in line.
Maurice Bishop and his men liberated the government from the shackles of imperialism. Under the Gary regime in the 1970s, the government deployed a secret police known as the Mongoose Gang, who were enlisted to harass, assault, and sometimes kill political dissidents. Before the 1979 revolution, unemployment was at 49%. 4 years into the revolution, unemployment was down to 14%. The revolution created 2,500 new jobs in agriculture, 2,500 new jobs in construction, and 500 new jobs in tourism. Many of these new jobs will be found in the construction of Grenada's first international airport, which would expand tourism to the country. The revolution also provided free health care and doubled the number of dentists and physicians in the island. There was an education campaign where banners and posters were plastered all over the country advocating for youth and adult education. There were 65 schools that were repaired and renovated, which hadn't been used in over 20 years. The lowest paid 30% of the population was exempt from taxation, and the World Bank reported in 1981 that Grenada was one of the few countries in the Western Hemisphere to actually experience per capita economic growth. Workers' cooperatives played a role in the economic growth, with the inspired volunteers assisting their fellow Grenadians. According to Rosa Maria Torres, a young Grenadian describes the new form of government to be compatible with the Maroon tradition in Grenada. It was stated that, quote, "The Maroon form is the way we pass around the village and ask people to give us help. Some give us corn, some give peas and yam. Then we put all together and cook, and those who come in the Maroon form on Saturday is free community work. The Maroon spirit is one of the best we have right now, because the people getting the feeling that they together again. And Maroon form is what we always do. Our ancestors too. So is very close to cooperatives. And with the government getting us together again, the people feeling like they are in Maroon form all the time." Close quote. Nevertheless, in October of 1983, the revolutionary movement would be brought to an end with infighting within the government. That would only be exacerbated by the U.S. interference. The United States invaded Grenada after the assassination of Maurice Bishop and immediately shut down much of the progress that the revolutionary government had made. However, regardless of the constant attempts to take away the freedom of Grenadians, their spirit of freedom and independence which stems from their African and Kalinago origins, remains in the spirit. That spirit of independence can be found in the way that the Grenadians on the island and throughout the world conduct themselves in their everyday lives. The self-sufficient Maroon lifestyle can be found today in Grenada in the way the people interact with one another. Everyone is celebrating 50 years of independence in Grenada. I say to that the Grenadian people have always been independent, whether the Western colonial and imperial nations wanted to recognize it or not. The struggle for freedom is a tug of war, and Grenadians, from day one, have never let up. For the Grenadians celebrating 50 years, happy independence. And for those that understand freedom is a constant struggle, keep up the good fight for freedom and justice. Peace.